What happens when a CEO goes undercover at his own company and gets shut out? Harold Kingston had built his financial empire from nothing. No silver spoon, no shortcuts, just decades of grit, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to doing things the right way. He had started as a college student with a dream and a pocket full of rejection letters, pushing through doors that weren't meant to open for men like him. Now, his name sat on the letterhead of one of the fastest-growing banks in the country. His decisions shaped the lives of thousands, customers, employees, shareholders. But lately, something had been gnawing at him. He had always prided himself on running a business built on integrity. Yet in the past few months, murmurs had reached his ears. Complaints, subtle at first, then louder. Stories of customers being dismissed, ignored, subtly pushed away. It didn't sit right with him. Harold didn't rely on second-hand reports. He never had. If something needed to be understood, he needed to see it with his own eyes. And so, the plan took root. No warning, no assistance, no cameras. Just him. He walked into his closet that morning and ignored the racks of designer suits, the silk ties, the polished leather shoes. Instead, he pulled out an old navy polo and a pair of jeans. Plain. Nothing that screamed money or influence. His Rolex stayed on the nightstand. He slipped into a pair of sneakers, ones with slightly worn soles. Then he stood in front of the mirror. The man staring back at him was still Harold Kingston, but stripped of every visible sign of power. No tailored suit, no commanding presence of an entourage. Just another man. Another customer. Perfect. He grabbed his phone and called for a cab instead of his usual private driver. As he stepped out of his penthouse, there was a brief moment of hesitation. Not doubt. He'd already committed. But curiosity. Would this be a waste of time? Would his employees rise to the standard he had set? Or was he about to confirm his worst fears? The drive through Los Angeles was quiet. Outside, the city moved at its usual restless pace, businessmen checking their watches, tourists taking pictures, street vendors setting up for the afternoon rush. But inside the cab, Harold was running through the possibilities. Maybe the complaints were exaggerated. Maybe it was just a few isolated incidents. But maybe it wasn't. His driver pulled up to the curb in front of one of his branches. A sleek, modern space, nestled between a high-end coffee shop and an insurance office. The kind of bank that was designed to feel approachable, yet professional. Harold paid the driver and stepped out. A deep breath, one step forward, then another. And the moment he pushed through those glass doors, the truth hit him faster than he was prepared for. Harold pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The scent of freshly printed receipts and faint traces of cleaning solution lingered in the air. The bank wasn't packed, just a handful of customers scattered throughout, some seated, some standing in line. The walls were lined with posters promoting investment plans, mortgage offers, and financial services. He took a few steps forward and paused. Not a single employee acknowledged him. At first, he thought he was imagining it. He glanced over at the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, tapping away at her keyboard. He waited for her to look up. A nod, a smile. Can I help you? Something. Nothing. Then, a man in a tailored suit walked in behind him. The receptionist's demeanor changed instantly. She straightened, smiled, and greeted him with a warm, "Good morning, sir. How can we assist you today?" Harold watched as the man was directed to a teller almost immediately. He clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe she was just distracted. So he stepped up to the counter where a young teller was finishing up with a customer. He waited his turn, hands in his pockets, glancing at the others in line. A well-dressed couple at the next window was receiving full attention, smiles, nods, detailed explanations about their transaction. Then it was his turn. The teller, a woman in her late 20s with perfectly curled hair, barely glanced at him. "What do you need?" Her voice was flat, disinterested. Harold gave her a polite smile. "I'd like to open a new high-value account." She sighed, as if he had just asked her to do something unbearable. "You need an appointment for that," she said. Harold frowned. "I checked your website before coming. It said walk-ins are welcome for new accounts." She barely looked up. "Yeah, well, not for those kinds of accounts." He glanced over at another customer at the next counter, another man in business attire. The teller there was walking him through account options with patience, handing him brochures, offering coffee. Harold turned back to his teller. "So, just to be clear, if I looked different, dressed different, you'd be treating me differently right now." She blinked, her expression tightening. "That's not what I said." Harold tilted his head. "But it's what you're doing." She exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. "Look, sir, maybe another branch would be a better fit for what you're looking for." His fingers curled into his palms. But he wasn't done testing just how deep this went. Harold could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he wasn't here to lash out. He was here to see, to understand. So he took a breath and played along. "All right," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Maybe I just need some information first. Can you tell me about your business account options?" The teller glanced at the line forming behind him and sighed again. Without a word, she reached under the counter, pulled out a crumpled brochure, and slid it across the desk. No explanation, no offer to walk him through the details. Harold picked up the paper and flipped through it. He already knew every word printed on it, but that wasn't the point. Across the room, another customer, an older man in a blazer, approached a different teller and asked the exact same question. The response? Enthusiastic, welcoming. The teller leaned forward, explained the benefits of different account types, even cracked a joke to make the process feel lighter. Harold looked down at the creased brochure in his hand. "Is there someone I can speak to about account recommendations?" he asked. The teller's lips pressed into a thin line. "That would be the branch manager, but—" "Great. I'd like to speak with them." She hesitated. Then, with the slightest smirk, she said, "He's busy." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Did you check?" "He's always busy." A pause. Then, without another word, she turned to the next person in line, effectively dismissing him. Harold stepped back. For a moment he just stood there. It wasn't just bad service. It was intentional. He glanced around the bank, watching the way other customers were treated. The ones who looked like they belonged were met with courtesy, efficiency, patience. And then there was him. Unnoticed, unwelcome, unimportant. But he wasn't leaving, not yet. Because now it was time to make himself heard. Harold wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone had built an empire. But right now, stripped of his usual image, he was seeing a reality he couldn't ignore. He walked past the teller without another word and made his way toward the glass-paneled office at the back of the branch. The manager's door was slightly ajar, and through it, Harold could see a man in a tailored gray suit sipping coffee, scrolling through his phone. Busy. Harold knocked lightly on the frame. The manager barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I was told I need an appointment to open a high-value account. But I just watched 2 other customers get full service with no issues." The manager finally looked up. His eyes flicked over Harold's plain attire, the lack of designer labels, the worn sneakers. His expression shifted into something polite but firm, the kind of smile that said, "I'd rather not deal with you right now." "Sir, if you'd like to apply for an account, I suggest you try one of our other branches," he said smoothly. Harold took a slow breath. "Why would I need to go to another branch when I'm already at one of my own?" The manager's expression barely changed. "It's just a matter of—" "Wait." His brows furrowed. Your own. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his executive ID. He placed it on the manager's desk with the kind of quiet authority that needed no explanation. The room seemed to shrink. The manager's eyes darted from the ID to Harold's face, back to the ID. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Mr. Kingston, I didn't realize. Harold tilted his head. Didn't realize what? The teller who had dismissed him earlier peeked around the corner, her face pale. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged him, suddenly looked very interested in her keyboard. The silence stretched. Harold let it. Then he spoke, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. You didn't realize I was someone who mattered? The manager opened his mouth but nothing came out. Harold leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. Tell me, if I hadn't revealed who I was, how would this have ended? Would you have called security? Escorted me out? Let me walk away thinking I wasn't good enough for my own institution? The manager stammered. Of course not, sir, Harold straightened. But you already did. The weight of his words settled in the air like a storm about to break. And now, every single person in that branch was waiting to see what he would do next. Harold stood there, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The room was thick with discomfort. No one dared to speak, as if hoping this would all somehow blow over. But it wouldn't, not this time. The manager's face was still frozen in shock, but Harold saw the flicker of panic beneath it. The teller who had dismissed him earlier stood near the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, avoiding eye contact. Harold picked up his executive ID and slipped it back into his pocket. Then, in the same calm, steady voice, he asked, "How many other customers have you turned away like this?" Silence. His eyes scanned the room. How many people have walked in here needing assistance and were made to feel small, dismissed, told to take their business elsewhere? The manager cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I assure you that's not how we operate. Harold let out a short, humorless laugh. I just watched it happen. To me. He shook his head, glancing at the employees. And if this is what happens when I'm standing in front of you, I don't want to imagine how my customers are treated when no one's watching. Security guard had stepped closer, sensing the shift in energy. But Harold wasn't a man who needed force to get his point across. Instead, he reached for his phone. Tap, then another. The manager stiffened as Harold scrolled through his contacts and hit call. Good morning, Mrs. Holloway, he said when his executive assistant picked up. I need an internal audit launched at the Los Angeles branch. Today. The manager paled. Yes, today, Harold confirmed. And while you're at it, have HR pull every customer complaint filed here in the past 6 months. Names. I want details. The employees shifted uncomfortably, the reality of the situation dawning on them. Harold ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Then he looked at the manager. You have 1 hour to gather your staff in the conference room. We're going to have a conversation about what kind of bank this is, and more importantly, what kind of bank it will be moving forward. The manager hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Harold didn't miss the way the receptionist finally, looked him in the eye. The way the teller exhaled sharply, as if realizing just how much damage she'd done. A single moment of bias. Good. Because change was coming. And this time, no one was sweeping it under the rug. An hour later, the employees of the Los Angeles branch sat stiffly in the conference room, the air thick with unease. Harold Kingston stood at the head of the long table, hands resting on the polished wood. He wasn't here to yell. He wasn't here to fire people on the spot. But he was here to make sure they understood the weight of what had just happened. He let the silence stretch before speaking. I built this institution from nothing. His voice was steady, controlled. Not because I was handed an opportunity. Not because doors were held open for me. I built it because I had to fight for it. I know what it's like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be made to feel like you don't belong. And the fact that it's happening inside my own bank? He shook his head. I will not tolerate it. Some of the staff avoided his gaze. The manager cleared his throat but wisely stayed silent. Harold continued. I walked into this branch today as an ordinary customer. I didn't throw my name around. I didn't expect special treatment. But what I did expect, what any customer should expect, was basic respect. He paused, letting his words sink in. What I got instead was excuses. Dismissiveness. Barriers thrown in my way for no reason other than someone deciding I wasn't worth their time. The teller, who had refused to help him, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Harold turned his eyes to her. Would you like to explain why you assumed I wasn't here for legitimate business? Her face burned red. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Harold gave her a beat. Nothing? I just thought... She started, but the words trailed off into nothing. Harold nodded once. That's the problem, isn't it? The room was painfully still. Then he exhaled, shifting gears. I don't run my business based on who looks the part and who doesn't. I run it on trust, on service, on making sure that when someone walks through those doors, they feel valued, not judged. If you can't provide that, you don't belong here. A heavy pause. Then he continued. Now, here's what's going to happen. Every single one of you is undergoing new training on customer relations. And it's not just going to be a quick seminar where you nod along and go back to business as usual. It's going to be real. It's going to make you uncomfortable, because that's what change feels like. The manager cleared his throat. Sir, You'll be the first one in that training. Harold cut in smoothly, since leadership starts at the top. The manager closed his mouth. Harold straightened. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. People deserve better. And from now on, that's exactly what they're going to get. He glanced around the room, taking in every nervous, guilty, and contemplative expression. Then he picked up his phone and sent out one final message. A direct email to every branch. A statement. A promise. A warning. Because from this moment forward, no one would walk into one of his banks and feel like they didn't belong. Not on his watch. Some lessons hit hard. But the hardest ones, those are the ones that change everything. What would you have done in Harold's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be a privilege, but a standard, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this, they need to be heard.